There is a woman who stood between her people and annihilation, and most of the world has never heard her name. In an era when European empires were carving Africa into pieces, when the Atlantic slave trade was consuming entire nations, when every kingdom that dared resist was eventually crushed, one queen not only resisted, she won. She outmaneuvered the Portuguese Empire, neutralized the Dutch, humiliated a succession of colonial governors, and freed an estimated 100,000 enslaved people over the course of her lifetime. Her name was Nzinga, Queen of Nongo and Matamba, and she is the reason Angola exists today in the form it does. For the African diaspora, for every descendant of the trade she fought against, for every community still searching for the evidence that their ancestors were not passive victims but active resistors, this history is not a footnote. It is a foundation. It is proof that black genius, black sovereignty, and black defiance were not born in the 20th century. They were born long before Europe learned to write Africa's story for it. What happened in Angola in the 17th century was not just a regional conflict. It was a civilizational battle, and a queen won it. That story belongs to you. To understand what Nzinga accomplished, you have to understand what she was up against. The Kingdom of Nongo, located in the territory that is now northwestern Angola, was a Mondo-speaking state that had existed for generations before Portuguese ships appeared on the coast of West Central Africa in the late 15th century. The Portuguese arrived in 1483, made contact with the neighboring Kingdom of Congo, and spent the next century and a half systematically dismantling the political architecture of the entire region. By the early 1600s, they had established the colonial city of Luanda on the Atlantic coast, and they were pushing inland with military force and missionary manipulation, capturing people and shipping them across the ocean to Brazil in numbers that were staggering even by the catastrophic standards of the transatlantic slave trade. West Central Africa, the region encompassing present-day Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, would eventually supply more enslaved Africans to the Americas than any other region on the continent, an estimated 5.5 million people over the full course of the trade. Nzinga was born around 1583, the daughter of King Kilonji of Nongo. From childhood, she was trained in diplomacy and statecraft, unusual for a woman in her society, but her father recognized something exceptional in her. When her brother Angolan took the throne after their father's death, Nongo was already under severe Portuguese military pressure. In 1621, Angolan sent Nzinga to Luanda to negotiate with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa. What happened in that room became legend. The governor, in an act designed to humiliate her, offered her no chair, only cushions on the floor, a deliberate signal that she was a subordinate petitioner, not an equal. Nzinga looked at one of her attendants, ordered the woman to kneel on all fours, and sat upon her back as a living throne. She conducted the entire negotiation from that position, as a sovereign equal. She secured a treaty, agreed to allow Portuguese missionaries into Nongo, and returned home having given nothing of substance while appearing to give everything. She was 38 years old, and she had just introduced herself to history. After her brother's death in 1626, under circumstances that remained disputed, Nzinga became ruler. The Portuguese immediately refused to recognize her authority, installed a puppet king in Nongo, and launched military campaigns to seize control of the region outright. What followed was 4 decades of extraordinary political and military genius. Nzinga allied with the Dutch when they arrived as rivals to Portugal. She absorbed and reorganized the Mbangala, fierce stateless warriors who had been working for the Portuguese, and turned them into her own military force. She retreated when necessary, regrouped, and established a new power base in the Kingdom of Matamba to the east, which she conquered and rebuilt into a formidable state. She used Christianity tactically, converting when it gave her diplomatic leverage, and she used African spiritual traditions when they served her political needs. She fought the Portuguese not just with armies but with sanctuary. Her territory became a destination for people escaping enslavement, and she organized the liberation of captives on a scale that dwarfs most of what we call the Underground Railroad. Now let us speak about what was erased, because the erasure of Nzinga's story was not accidental. It was a project. The Portuguese colonial administration had enormous institutional interest in diminishing her legacy. A queen who had exposed their treaties as fraudulent, who had defeated their military campaigns, who had offered refuge to escaped enslaved people and organized armed resistance across an entire region, her existence was an ideological problem. Colonial records from the 17th century systematically portrayed Nzinga as a cannibal, a murderess, a woman of unnatural appetites who violated every norm of civilized behavior. These accounts, written by Portuguese missionaries and administrators, were the primary sources that European historians used for centuries to construct the narrative of Nzinga as a curiosity rather than a conqueror. The missionary Giovanni Antonio Cavazzi, who spent time in her court in her later years and claimed to be sympathetic to her, still wrote about her through a framework that emphasized her supposed savagery and the civilizing work of the Church. That framework was then exported into European encyclopedias, academic texts, and eventually into the popular imagination of a world that was building its economy on the assumption that African people were either primitive or non-existent as historical agents. The specific acts of erasure extended beyond written records. The oral traditions of the Monde people, which preserved Nzinga's story in sophisticated detail, were actively undermined by colonial missionary education systems that taught children to distrust the knowledge of their elders. The archives of the Kingdom of Nongo itself, whatever records, governance systems, and institutional memory existed, were not preserved or translated or studied the way Greek and Roman records were. They were simply not considered history by the people who defined history. When the scramble for Africa formalized European dominance of the continent in the 1880s, Portugal's claim to Angola was partly legitimized by a historical narrative that positioned the Portuguese as the civilizing force in a lawless land, and a queen who had spent 40 years proving that narrative force had to remain obscure for that claim to hold. Even in the 20th century, during Angola's brutal colonial period under Salazar's Estado Novo regime, Nzinga's memory was carefully managed. She was not taught in colonial schools. Her story was not part of the curriculum. The people whose ancestors she had fought for were educated in a system designed to make them forget that anyone had ever fought for them at all. What survived is extraordinary, precisely because it survived against that kind of organized pressure. The Mondo oral tradition never let Nzinga go. Across generations, grandmothers and elders kept her story in the spoken word, in ceremony, in the names given to daughters and the moral frameworks handed down through families. The Kimbundu language itself, which Nzinga spoke and governed in, survived Portuguese colonization and today remains one of the major national languages of Angola, spoken by millions. The cultural practices of the Monde people, their music, their relationship to ancestral memory, their systems of matrilineal identity, carry the shape of the world she helped defend. The capoeira tradition, which is practiced today across Brazil and the world as both a martial art and a cultural expression, has direct roots